Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's been a few weeks since I've released an episode. Been super busy over here. We had Easter. We had a bunch of rallies we were doing at the Capitol with Fight 1312, a coalition that came together in the last 16 weeks to resist a tyrannical bill. You can go hear about that on my previous episode. But today I'm really excited to have a guest who I've wanted to have on for a while after he got published in First Things. He goes by the pen name Lomez, but he is Jonathan Keeperman. And so we're going to talk about his article in First Things regarding the Longhouse and also some other things. He's been recently featured in the New York Times, an interview there about kind of Passage Press and the things he's doing with Passage Press. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity to introduce you to him. And we're going to get into a variety of matters related to not just the Longhouse, but right wing versus left wing, aesthetics, and his own kind of journey with Christianity, his appreciation of it and hesitancy, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to have a great time talking about that with Lomez. Before we get into that, I wanted to make sure you knew about a couple of sponsors of the program. First, Farmer Bill Provisions. If you're looking for a beef jerky that's high in protein, you need to go to Farmer Bill Provisions. They offer biltong, which is a great supplement for protein, and it's all natural as opposed to like when I run by the gas station, I'm picking up a Celsius, Red Bull, or some kind of energy drink, and I want some protein. A lot of that beef jerky you're going to pick up there is laden with preservatives and sugars and other things you don't need. Farmer Bill Provisions brings you biltong, which is not laden with anything. It's all natural. It's American made. You can go to farmerbillprovisions.com, use code FOOLPROOF, FULLPROOF, and get 20% off your order. If you go over there today and order that, it's a great product. I enjoy it. I think you will too. farmerbillsprovision.com. Also want to let you know about Legacy Profits Club. A lot of people today are interested either in a side hustle or becoming anti-fragile. A great way to do that is get involved with investing. One of the risks you take with getting involved with investing is losing all of your money. You don't want to do that, and Legacy Profits Club is here to help. They are a friend to the program, and Derek over there does a great job of helping people understand what the risks are in investing and how to avoid those, coming up with strategies that can be profitable for you. He provides coaching and classes, and I've got my link to his classroom in the show notes. You can head over to that link and join up at Legacy Profits Club and sign up for his program. And then lastly, I wanted to thank all my Patreon supporters. Thank you for supporting me and continuing to support. If you are not supporting the program, I would invite you to support the program. It's the main way I can keep this program coming to you. I enjoy making content. I would do it for free if at all possible, but I really appreciate the support there. If you sign up today, you get early access to every episode I record. You also get direct access to me. You get some swag, $5, $15 a month to get you in the door. Head over to the Patreon. The link is in the show notes. All right, like I said, we're going to have a great conversation with Lomez, so let's get into it. Coming to us from a former Anon life where he went by the name Lomez. He goes by actually Jonathan Keeperman. John, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Chase, thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
Well, I did want to ask right off the bat, because I came across your account on X, Lomez. I was seeing what you were publishing, and I still to this day don't know where the name Lomez comes from. I don't know if it's like internet slang or ancient, a lot of times they'll do ancient philosophy. I don't know if it's a story. Like, what does Lomez mean?
No, it's much more mundane than all of that. Lomez started in like early 2000s when I was in college. I was, doing like fantasy sports with my friends, and you need to come up with a name that you have on your like Yahoo account. And there's this Seinfeld episode, and one of Kramer's like off-screen friends is this guy named Lomez. And you never see Lomez. He doesn't ever show up on screen. He's kind of this mysterious figure. And I thought, well, that's kind of different. It's sort of ethnically illegible, but it's also sort of memorable and yet simple at the same time. And I thought, why not? I'll just be Lomez. And then, and this is the thing, I think we'll get into this in a moment. I actually don't know how old you are. I think we're close enough in age that around this time in the early 2000s, you were sort of creating this digital identity.
Yeah.
And this is something that I didn't realize at the time, but is now obvious in hindsight. it's almost like this dual life that people our age have kind of lived for the majority of our adult lives, which is you have an online life and then you have a regular life, and these things intersect in certain ways, but stay segregated in other ways. And this identity of this thing called Lomez, which I then started blogging under and, just doing other stuff. I was writing in comment sections on other people's blogs, etc., just stuck with me and eventually became this thing I used also for Twitter. So yeah, that's sort of the story behind it.
That's great. So there wasn't some kind of like master plan, like I'm gonna become some famous Anon account. It was just like a fantasy football league. I'm
Not
gonna
even
come up with a
close.
name.
Like you needed like an account name so that you could post stuff on like blogspot.com. Okay. And it's like we all had to come up with something. And maybe there's like some disconnect here where I think people of a certain age just understood at some point that you don't do this under your real name. And it
Yeah.
wasn't like even at the time I'm like trying to hide something, or you're going to be trafficking in maybe forbidden territory or something. It's like, no, you have this other online identity that's separate from your regular identity. And so that's where it all began.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad I didn't do that because mine was like FT ball RB 307.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that I don't think that would, maybe I could start an X account with that and on, but now it's out in the open, so I can't do it.
Right.
That's great.
Someone's going to take it.
Yeah, someone's totally going to take it. As far as anonymity and using a pseudonym online, it's actually been quite a debate. I've defended it on my podcast why it can be prudent, but do you think that using an anon online in our day and age is still a prudential, like it can be good, can be bad? What might you say to that?
Yeah, there's definitely pros and cons to it. I am a major defender of people who choose to go online and be anonymous and participate in public discourse anonymously. I mean, people will point out and have pointed out that, this is well within our sort of civil discourse tradition. Anonymity is a major part of how certain ideas are communicated, especially those ideas that are sort of coming from right outside the edge of the Overton window. And there's a great deal of value in that. It allows a kind of something I've thought about a lot is this sort of interior freedom. It's not even the case that you adopt an online persona in order to protect yourself from blowback that you might get from your employer or your community or whatever, although that is an aspect of it. There's this other more subtle aspect of it, which is as our lives become sort of fully online in ways that I was previously talking about, starting in 2000, your entire record of thought and communication is static, and you become tied to beliefs that you were communicating as a 20-year-old idiot, because when you're 20 years old you want to experiment with ideas, and what you lose then, because that is all recorded, is the easy ability to just transition to new modes of thinking and just slough off those old ideas that are no longer relevant to your personality, or just again might have been part of this like experimental stage. And what anonymity allows is a sort of freedom to participate in a just much broader spectrum of ideas without being permanently tethered to those ideas for the rest of your life. And that's a great thing. And it's something that we should all have. And, for the majority of human experience, you could, over the course of your life, sort of author your own identity, author your own narrative in real time, and kind of emphasize certain things about your past and not others. And that's fine. There's nothing inauthentic about that. And I think we lose that in an era where we are attached to this perfect digital record. So again, anonymity is a way to sort of circumvent around that a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. I became a pastor in my mid 20s, and early as a pastor, we have a responsibility before the Lord to divide the word rightly. And yet pastors are also people, and they change over time. And so you can go back and hear some of my sermons from that day, or from those days, when I would look back and really cringe at them in terms of the illustrations I used, or even some of the principles I might have been defending, trying to use scripture, whether it's liberalism or other things like that. And there's a bit of a it's always been a confusing thing to me, I will say, because I'd rather read old dead guys and you can kind of get a full picture. But oftentimes what we miss in historical studies is like seeing how their views change and developed over time, something that is afforded to us online, which we don't get often in our studies. Instead, we kind of like cast type them as like, oh, you're always this guy. And it's like, yeah, I can definitely see how anonymity can free you from that. But all of this kind of existence for you kind of came to a head in the last couple of years, where you were doxxed online. It's something that's happened to me, but not to the degree that you got doxxed, because I have my face online, so it's not really a surprise who I am. But when people come after your church and get you kicked out of places, that can be difficult. But I imagine this was pretty difficult time for you. Can you kind of tell the audience a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, so let me just say that the main reason I was anonymous in my public discussions, like on Twitter and elsewhere before the docs, was to protect myself from professional repercussions. We were in an era, basically from 2016 on, and we can debate where it all started. But let's just say during the Trump administration, if you were an open Trump supporter and on the right, in certain professional milieus, like the one I was an academic. I was teaching in the UC system, University of California system, just by virtue of being a Trump supporter, let alone other more provocative things that I might want to communicate online. You were putting yourself at serious professional risk. And so, and like reputational risk that would potentially follow you around for the rest of your life. For making what I believed were very straightforward, sort of like statements that were entirely defensible. Things like Kyle Rittenhouse, I didn't think should have been persecuted in the way that he was, that his actions were defensible. That was something, when I was doxxed, that was pointed to as evidence of my wrongthink. So, okay, so this is all to say that I was in this professional milieu where these ideas were verboten. COVID comes along. My views on COVID are also, let's just say, heterodox to the prevailing sort of liberal view, and certainly in opposition to the view of the school I was at. And then all the DEI woke stuff just really exacerbated and sort of accelerated this stuff. So then in 2000, it was a year ago, really. I mean, it feels like a lot longer than that, but it was just a year ago that I was doxxed by The Guardian. I had by this point had a somewhat substantial online following, enough so that The Guardian, this, I think it's the 5th biggest newspaper in the world, felt it was newsworthy to reveal my identity to their audience, which is completely bizarre, but we can get into that. And now by this point, I had started to separate myself from my previous career. So there's this other thing happening where I started a publishing company, and my life as an academic was coming to an end. So it was less disruptive than it might have otherwise been. But The Guardian reveals my identity. They point out some of my worst offenses in tweets where I said things like Kyle Rittenhouse was innocent, or I at one point defended Milo Yiannopoulos' right to speak on college campuses, what I thought was a very innocuous defense, very liberal, frankly, defense of free speech. I was publishing people like Ernst Jünger, who was a German nationalist. They would never explain what a German nationalist was. You were supposed to, as a reader, just infer that meant he was a Nazi. Sure. Ernst Jünger was not a Nazi, but that's another thing we can get into. So what were the effects of this article that came out? One, from a professional standpoint, it was entirely positive. This was a surprise that it was taken so well. Something like this previously would have potentially really harmed the ability of someone in my position to maintain a kind of foothold in mainstream conservative media slash spaces. But the exact opposite happened. Like NatCon and some more official sort of conservative spaces, think tanks, etc., really embraced me, and I owe them a great deal of gratitude for their willingness to step out and say, you know what, we're not going to play this game anymore of cancellation. And so I was able to sort of maintain a sort of professional life in the public sphere, despite the attempt by the Guardian to cut that off at the knees, which is exactly what the point of the docs was. Then there's the personal aspect of it. And on the personal side, it was a much different story. My family, who are libs, and many of my old acquaintances were just totally taken aback by this. And it created some really awkward conversations. And then, interpersonally with my wife and children and at their school, there was just some like really awkward conversations to have, because the way that the Guardian wanted to paint me was as this, basically an illegitimate person, that I shouldn't be allowed to have a public presence, that I was a bad guy, that I was some kind of villain or evil person. And to explain to these people that didn't have proper context that this was not true, that there was some broader, way of interpreting what all this meant, it just required like a long conversation that frankly you can't have with everybody in your personal life. And so people, you just lose people, and it's sort of disappointing, but you learn who your real friends are, I guess.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I never had the doxing in that way where it was a non to, to full disclosure, this is who I am. It was more of a slow burn of like, I get on Twitter and I say some things, get connected with some people, and then it's like, I get the local paper writing a hit piece on me and my wife. And, that has real world implications, but I've been thankful that we have the Christian community. And while some of them may perceive me as a radical, they've been kind, still voicing their disagreements and their kindness, but they're like, they know it's illegitimate, but it is hard. The left is very talented at framing and trying to put a puzzle together that's not there, to make it appear as if somebody's entirely wicked and not somebody that should be allowed in polite society.
Yeah. And I think in my case, again, this was just a year ago, and I'm not sure. I can't remember when your exact kind of situation unraveled, or at what point this was, is that this general audience, this kind of quote unquote normie audience, this not very online audience, while they still in some sense get hypnotized by this language that they read in the Guardian, and everything is just like Nazi. They see these like Nazi alarm bells going off, and that's like their way of interpreting this stuff. It's always a search for the next sort of Nazi under the bed. There's still some of that, and they're still susceptible to some of that. But on the other hand, over the last 10 years, but really since like 2020, the wokeness cancellation era, the general public has become inured to some of these tactics, and they're just not as effective as they used to be. And it's much easier to sell the idea to, when I'm talking to like my cousin or something, like, no, you got to understand, like the Guardian is not doing this in a good faith way. Me, but also you've seen how they've treated other people in the past. And then they start to think, yeah, I do remember what they said about this other person who actually, I kind of like Joe Rogan, and they were calling him a Nazi,
right.
6 months ago. And yeah, I kind of like this other person who was cast as a villain a year ago. And so they're starting to do the math that there is some plausible case that you're not the bad guy that you're being made out to be.
Totally. Yeah. The article that came out, I guess, a couple of years ago, called us the leader of the Christian Taliban in Boulder. And I'm like, they're just at this point, the Nazi thing is tired. They still say that, but they're just grasping for anything to smear and to label in order for people to disassociate.
What was the outlet that came after you?
It was just a local Daily Camera, and it was an op-ed.
Okay.
And now it's all behind a paywall. So like, it's mainly they do the deeds of darkness on a horrible place, a cesspool called Reddit, and that's where they coordinate publicly. and so you can see their schemes. But yeah, they try to gin up a lot of stuff on there too. So it's a terrible place. No one should ever go there. Um, well, one of the things that kind of came out of your writing, and this was before the doxing, was you writing in First Things under your pseudonym, um, using the phrase Longhouse. Now, I'm going to put a link to the article in the show notes. I found it a helpful explainer for this terminology. And as I've shared it with other Christians, particularly Christian men and ministers, we found this immediately relevant and like understandable to us. But at the same time, you know, one of the dangers when you kind of adopt a lot of online lingo, or like one of them is gay race communism, which is now normalized. It's been published in the New York
Right.
Times, but you start
Yeah.
adopting these words without really understanding their origin story. And so I wanted to have you on to say, is longhouse a word that we should attribute Lomez coined the word longhouse, or has this come from somewhere else?
No, the etymology of this is a little bit tricky to pin down, but really the source for this is Bronze Age Pervert's book, Bronze Age Mindset. And there is a section in the middle of the book where he talks about his concept of the longhouse. And I happened to be reading that when I was formulating my argument that I was going to subsequently make in First Things. And what struck me about the term was not so much the sort of connotations that BAP was assigning to the term, but it was sort of visually useful for me. And then also something I think, just from a rhetorical standpoint, you're looking for with a coinage is something that's easy to remember, but then also isn't already freighted with other kinds of meaning. So you want a reader coming to it without, filling in the semiotic space of this term with other stuff that they already have in mind. And so I thought it was an obscure enough term where I could just do that for the reader. I could say, here's just this blank thing, what we call like an empty signifier, and I'm going to fill in for you what it means, but at the same time, it's not random. There is a kind of automatic visual impression that you get when you think about this term. And maybe even you also think about a kind of agrarian domestic space. And so that's really where it began for me. I will say this, and I've had conversations with BAP about this. There is a difference between BAP's usage of the term and my usage of the term. So I don't want people to think that, these are the same things. They're not the same things. But that is where the origin comes from.
Okay, and then for the listeners who haven't been enlightened yet by how
Yeah.
you filled in the term, maybe give an explainer. Like I said, I'll link the article, but give an explainer for the listener who maybe is unfamiliar with how you've described the longhouse.
Okay, so the longhouse is the idea that over the last, put your own sort of number on how long this has been going on. Okay, we could say this has been going on for a long time. We could say that this has been going on, since post-war. Sort of feminism became a major sort of political force in this country. We could say that this is, really a phenomenon of the post-Cold War era or the sort of 21st century. And all of those things are right, but what all of this amounts to is a kind of feminization of public space and private space for that matter. And when I say feminization, I don't mean to suggest that it is matriarchal. Matriarchal would mean that it is women specifically who are running these spaces. It is sometimes women, but it's also sometimes men. The idea, however, is that whether it is men or women who are nominally in charge of these public spaces, and what do we mean by public spaces? We mean our churches. We mean our corporate sort of where we work, HR departments. We mean in our culture. We mean sort of across the board in our schools in particular, where we teach our children on the playground, everywhere, even in sports, even places that were traditionally masculine, like in our military. These spaces have come to be dominated by forms of organization and social control that mirror how women control their social spaces and the kinds of priorities and preferences that women put on social organization. Now, I want to say something else here. There is nothing wrong with how women operate socially. It is contextually dependent. There are certain places and reasons why you want a kind of more feminized social control of a space. But there are other contexts where you want a more masculine control of space. And what we've seen with the idea of the Longhouse is across the board, that sort of masculine way of dealing with certain social organization has been completely or almost completely sidelined in place of a more feminine way of doing things. And I can sort of explain what some of that might mean, but that is the broad conception of the
Yeah.
Longhouse.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've talked with Stephen Wolf on a previous episode of the concept of gynocracy. I think is how you say it. Gynocracy. Is that similar into kind of rule of women? Is that kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, but it is. It's fine, and people have offered these other terms to describe this. I would just say that again, what like gynocracy or matriarchy suggests is that like literally women are in charge.
Sure.
And that's not what I mean by this.
Okay.
So I think it's just it's off a little bit. I mean, any of these terms could be potentially useful, and like
Sure.
I sometimes get really frustrated with this obsession about like theory and terminology, and there's this kind of reification of these ideas where you lose track of the territory you're trying to map with these things when you get too fixated on terminology. So yeah, I just, I try not to like get too into the weeds about some of this stuff.
Totally. So maybe give me an example if somebody's going like, okay, I can sense what you're putting down in terms of feminine kind of social control. What would be an example you might provide that would illuminate that for them in their lives, whether it's like HR, school, library, politics?
Yeah.
I mean, I have tons, but I'm wondering what would be a pertinent example that you might use.
Here's like a, there's a few, I think what you need to start with are the hierarchy of values that exist in feminist spaces versus more masculine spaces. And when you're in, and again, I want to just reiterate here, I think it is important that like there are places where it's better to have the more feminine way of doing things. So safety is a major sort of priority in these spaces. Consensus, making sure that everybody feels like heard and that everybody agrees. This also sort of points to avoiding offense. There are ways of handling disputes that are different. So in a masculine space, there's a more kind of competitive or even combative way of testing one set of ideas versus another. Sometimes that manifests in literal physical combat. And that's fine, but it doesn't always have to be physical combat. It can be in the way that we contest ideas with one another. We sort of fight, we argue over which ideas are better. And sometimes that gets personal and makes people feel upset and make people feel offended. But the priority, the thing we're seeking with that sort of combative way of testing ideas is to arrive at truth. And that's a, important component of any kind of discursive atmosphere. Whereas in more feminine spaces, that's not as important as making sure that people aren't offended. And what you lose in terms of getting at truth, you gain in terms of this sort of consensus and comfort and feeling of safety. So that's like one example.
That's great. Yeah. And I think the reason for a lot of Christian men and pastors it connected is because over the last, I don't even know. I'm in my late 30s, so I've only known ministry where I am, but I grew up in the church and it was fairly masculine. Men wore suits, it was big. They were very truth forward, but you sense this shift to more feminine norms. Don't offend, don't
Mhm.
upset. And a lot of guys just are fed up with it. They're done with it. And they're tired of, either if you're a parishioner and you're listening, you're tired of your pastor kind of like nuancing everything to death so that nothing's clear. Or if you're a pastor, you're fed up because you feel controlled by your congregation. You feel like you're muzzled from actually saying what you think plainly from God's word because you don't want to upset anyone. And so I think, I've seen a lot of pastors turn into a verb. Oh, you're so longhoused, all that kind of stuff, as like a playful insult, or truly identifying somebody as longhoused or an organization as longhouse. I've also seen the image of the longhouse with fire now, people suggesting we need to
Yeah.
burn down the longhouse. So
Yeah.
maybe give me some, like, okay, so if that's a useful category and we think it has some tracking with like a society we're operating within, what do we do about it? I mean, do we just cave to the longhouse and just accept that we have to tread on thin ice, or do we retreat? Do we build a different house? Do we revolt? What do we do with the longhouse then?
Well, I think, one reason that the longhouse is so persistent is that its very nature uh, deters any kind of sort of combative counterforce to overturn or challenge it. In other words, like, again, if the hierarchy of values has like consensus towards the top, anybody who wants to come in and kind of disrupt the apple cart and challenge whether or not this is the right way of doing things is in defiance of this core value. So there's some amount of sort of self-reinforcing, there's a self-reinforcing quality to this thing that makes it very robust, actually. And it's an interesting thing to think about. Then, how do we successfully counteract some of its more insidious consequences? I think what it ultimately requires, whether it's men or women, is a kind of masculine defiance of this thing. It is to just say, we are not going to abide by the preferences being imposed on us by this way of organizing ourselves. And we're going to justify that defiance, not just because it's like this chaotic lashing out. And that's sometimes what starts it. And that's sort of okay within certain limits, but it's not enough on its own to just do this sort of chaotic lashing out. You want some kind of telos or end in mind. And I think in order to justify this, you have to assert too that we want to be able to build better things. We want to be able to go out and take risks and make new discoveries. What that ultimately entails, though, is a certain amount of failure, actually. And risk taking ultimately entails a certain amount of sort of suffering and disappointment and things. People are going to get hurt along the way. And we're going to have some amount of tolerance for that. But this is the only way to sort of continue building. I mean, one visual metaphor that actually BAP uses for the longhouse that I find useful is it has this kind of like flattening effect. He calls this a kind of yeast life, this sort of like bacterial low sort of colonization of everything. And it's horizontal. What we want, what I want, what I think creates sort of higher, better things is the reassertion of hierarchies, a vertical way of thinking about the world. Now, verticality in this sense, what I mean is hierarchy. Okay, like competing impulses where we make actual determinations, value judgments that certain things are actually better than others and worth defending. And should take actual precedent and priority over lower things. Now this gets tricky. Who gets to determine what's higher and what's lower and all the other things that come along with that? But I think we at least have to start by being willing to live within that frame. Now, let me just say this. I realize here as I'm going on and on, I'm dealing in a lot of abstraction. So I apologize for that. But these are kind of like, somewhat fuzzy ideas we're getting at here.
No, it's great because it tracks. I mean, this is something I've tried to emphasize in my preaching, especially recently, is like God created a world of order and hierarchy. Now, that can go bad, but what has happened recently in a lot of preaching, teaching, commentary for Christians is they want to emphasize the egalitarian nature of the Bible, and they'll pervert a lot of stuff. Both liberal and conservative churches will do this. They'll highlight passages like there's no Greek, no Jew, no slave nor free, no man or woman. And for the leftist tranny, they're going to take that to go, therefore everything's permissible. And then for the more conservative, they're gonna talk about the image of God and how we're all equal, but they're gonna de-emphasize all the time hierarchy. And people get scared by that word. They don't need to be scared by that word. It's a beautiful thing that God has made in our world, where there is hierarchy in terms of the home, in terms of the church, in terms of competition, in terms of risk taking. Some people succeed. It's all under the providence of God. And so it's not something that we need to be scared of. But yeah, I do sense that kind of like, you need to be able to disagree. And I think for a lot of Christians, I'll just kind of go off on this. For a lot of Christians, they have an impulse to want to share the gospel with other people. And what they've been taught is, I would say, a Longhouse form of evangelism. With evangelism, what you want to be able to do is talk to somebody and say, this is where we have disagreement. This is what God's word says. This is what I believe. I think you should believe that too. And then we can have a discussion. What often happens, though, is Christians will find themselves in blue cities, blue states, and they've been taught, never offend, never upset, never say I disagree. Just go along with it. Just go along with it. And maybe one day you can share about the good news of Jesus Christ with them if they have a crisis moment in their life, or if they notice that your life is better than theirs. Something like that may come. And so they've been used to hearing their neighbor say something in affirmation of transgender ideology, and they've been taught to remain silent. They've been taught, in the name of being a good Christian, they've been taught to just say nothing. And I think this is ludicrous behavior. I've said this, and I've been trying to teach people, look, like you talked about, to kind of revolt. And it's not even that revolting, to just like say no. Just say, if somebody says something that disagrees with the Bible and disagrees with our convictions as Christians, to say, yeah, I disagree with that. And then have a conversation. It's really not complicated, but even that for so many people is like, woo, you're going to upset the consensus. You're going to offend, all this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, they've baptized it now. And that's what we're seeing in churches with DEI, is once you baptize these ways of being with spiritual language, now you've bound people, bound their consciences and souls to obey the Longhouse. Otherwise, you're going against the faith. I just think this is very corrupt, very pernicious behavior. I know we're going to talk about kind of a little bit of faith later, but I didn't know if that had any similarities to what you're talking about.
Well, one thing that this brings to mind is actually that impulse you're talking about, that charitable impulse, I actually think is a beautiful thing. And you don't want to pathologize it or make people feel like it's a weakness to feel charitably towards people. But then you also want to like stiffen their spine and also say that you can't let that charitable impulse be used against you, be weaponized against you, and ultimately lead to a kind of total passivity where you can no longer assert positive values in opposition to negative values. And, this is, I think, whether it's in the church, it might be even more salient, but you see this kind of everywhere, is that charitable impulse being weaponized against people in a way that kind of neuters their ability to speak in a kind of full-throated way about the things they believe in. And I find that actually really sort of tragic and something that is worth taking head on.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think you're right. The impulse to charity is good, and that should be honored more. I've just seen so many people, either lose their faith or just compromise left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And just for average everyday citizens who maybe aren't even Christians, they're just so used to not saying something and not,
Mm-hmm.
not having the conversation and just avoiding offense at all cost. What?
Can I ask
Yeah,
a
go ahead.
question? I'm curious, point of view, whether you see this this problem. Uh, is it more acute within the church, within churchgoers, than in secular life, or is it sort of like across the board that you're seeing this? And
I
and then
don't
also I would say, I just want to ask too, as a follow up, like if it's the case that this is very acute within the church, I'm curious why you think that is.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely acute within the church. I'm not as well versed in HR departments or other, but I know from experience and just ministering to people who are in corporations, technology, medical fields, college campus, whatever it may
Mm-hmm.
be, that it's also a problem there, where people aren't allowed to say ideas that they may think because they'll get brought before the Civil Rights Commission or they'll get brought before some college
Yeah.
council or something. So I
Right.
do think it is broad spectrum. So it's not just, but I think Christians, the reason it frustrates me is because we're Christians. Like we believe that we live in Christ, that if we die, we don't die. We rise again at the second. This is like core Christian belief. And therefore, what do we have to be afraid of? I would rather be reining Christians in on charity. Hey, maybe don't be that person all the time than
Mm-hmm.
having to goad Christians to speak up. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
frustrated me is like, of all people, and that's what I'm still trying to do at our church is like when the world has this kind of like woke police, cancel culture, you can't really speak your mind of all the places, I want the church to model that charity because we know Jesus, we know love, and we can model that charity well. We can have
Yeah.
real disagreements. We can show people what it means to actually live that beautiful life, together in harmony because we're not so tethered to one another. We're not enmeshed. We don't our identity is not found in what other people think of us. It's in what God thinks of us. And so I think it's an acute problem in the church only in the sense that like it's been adopted, whether subconsciously or overtly, and then been laden with spiritual language. So now it has eternal consequences if you buck against Longhouse kind of like
Mm-hmm.
rhetoric and norms, feminine
Mm-hmm.
norms, especially if you're a
Mm-hmm.
man. You're taught when you go to small group or whatever you have at your church, you can't upset anyone. And this even happens in men's small groups where it's like we're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to get along and get coffee and behave like women generally. And the whole church culture is shaped that way. And it's really sad what it's become. And so it frustrates me to no end because I'm like, of all the places where I think there could be this beautiful life offered to people, the church is failing in my estimation, not necessarily ours, but it's really struggling nationally in our culture.
You know what's interesting about that, and I'm happy to move on to the next thing whenever you want. But you mentioned even in the men's groups, you see this also happening. And one thing I've noticed too, and throughout my life, like I was an athlete for most of my early part of my life and played college sports, and it's still, even in those contexts, I never like it's hard to find like male spaces really anywhere in our culture that don't just ape the sort of style of interpersonal relationships that are sort of preformed from our time in public schools and in these longhouse spaces. So I think this is also a major problem, is this missing uh, sort of own space for men, and how we reconstruct that and do it in a way that's like positive, and where we can and assert a certain kind of like muscularity and lack of uh, concern over whether we're upsetting certain norms, or all this kind of stuff. And you asked like what are some things we can do to sort of push against this. I think one really straightforward thing is reestablishing like male centered spaces that explicitly male, and not
Yeah.
for no girls allowed club. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Really,
Yeah.
I think
And
that's important.
you see churches doing this, and this will be the last thing, because I think we could talk the whole thing, but I want to get to some of the work you're doing to build a beautiful world. Is that a lot of churches will do men's retreats, they'll do stuff like that, and I actually see this. A lot of it's in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of evangelical churches will host these kind of like camping trips. They're going to shoot guns, ride horses, do that kind of stuff, and I think that's great. It's male only space. They're doing masculine things. But I'm afraid what I've noticed and what I've seen in my experience at a lot of these men's retreats is they always revert back to a spirituality that is coded feminine. And the spirituality itself becomes about emotional healing from father wounds from your dad, and how Jesus can heal your father wounds. And I'm like, man, like, it would be better if you spent that time, like, honestly, like, having to maybe have a debate about big ideas, get some guys in there that can duke it out intellectually, like have a boxing match, but don't revert back to, like, it's important to share emotions. It's important to have community. I don't want to denigrate that too much, of course, but there's almost this hunger still where even in these male spaces, we need those kind of masculine aesthetics, but we also need masculine discourse to where we're not reducing Christianity to some Xanax that you take.
Therapy culture, right? It just becomes another form of therapy culture.
Exactly. And that's what makes me kind of frustrated. Maybe I just need to start my own men's retreat. I don't know. But that kind of gets into a little bit of what I want to talk to you with Passage Press. So you referenced it earlier. You started this publishing house, Passage Press. How does this kind of fit into the larger project of what you're trying to do in terms of contributing to a beautiful world, kind of forwarding a vision with aesthetics, beauty, art, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, this is has become my life project, and I kind of stumbled into this almost by accident. I mean, everything you can look back and see where all this stuff was inevitable or whatever, but as it's been happening, it's really just felt like something else is directing this, and I'm trying to piece together the significance of it and the motivations for it sort of as I go. And where I've settled on, at least for now, is something I've observed throughout my adult life when I got interested in the world of ideas and literature. And actually kind of started a little later, sort of. I was well past my undergrad stage where I really got invested in like a life of the mind, and ultimately went back to grad school and then started teaching, is that there's been this massive and maybe intentional, I think, severing of our sort of cultural, literary, kind of intellectual inheritance. For men, I think our age in particular, this is very observable. If you spend any time speaking to even well-educated peers, like, they don't know anything. They're not very well read, or it's like just random bits and pieces that they've picked up here and there, but there's no sort of continuity to it. There's no broad sort of civilizational narrative attached to it. Now, there are certain exceptions. There are like classics schools, and there are, even places like in the Ivy League, Columbia famously has this great classics curriculum, and they teach like what amounts to a canon. But for most of us, that doesn't exist, even if we're intellectually curious. And in my own modest way, what one thing I'm trying to do, not at the scale of civilization, but at least the world of ideas from, like, let's say the last 100 years or so, is kind of recreate what I think is a kind of continuous narrative and coherent narrative that is both aesthetic. So in terms of its sort of there's like a visual language to it. There's a kind of moral language to it. There's a spiritual language to it. There's also just like, there's history. There's a history of ideas, a philosophy, and what I want to try to do is sort of reconstruct what I think is a more stable, more meaningful sort of set of ideas for people to have, so that they can better understand not just where they came from, but the world they're in, and then of course make better decisions about what they want to do for the world they're trying to create in the future. And to me, this is a big combination of, novels and it's poetry and it's art and it's philosophy and it's these old out of print texts. And it's also like, it's highbrow, it's middlebrow, it's lowbrow, it's kids books, it's pulp, it's everything. And, I'm trying to do this as much as I can and as fast as I can, but that's the big project. That's the goal.
That's great. With your project, part of that gets into aesthetics, and you had the honor of going on the New York Times recently, being interviewed. So you talked about that on there a little bit, but I do want to hear a bit about right-wing aesthetics, particularly. Before we discuss that, actually, I have a question, because a lot of Americans still are uncomfortable calling themselves right-wing. Christians have been beat over the head that they're not supposed to be partisan or not supposed to be political. When we say right wing, what are we talking about?
Now that's a question. That is a good question. I mean, I have to say that while I have certain ideas about a positive vision for what it means to be on the right, for now, it is perfectly sufficient that right just means not being on the left.
Sure.
And I know people will dispute that and will have, take issue with such a broad and reactive definition. But I actually think it's a strategic mistake to be too narrow in a definition right now. We're not quite at that stage yet. And, I'm sort of a big tent guy, and I want to actually, one thing that I think is important with my project, and I've talked about this, and we'll get into this in a second. This will dovetail with the next question, because what does it mean to be right wing and be an artist, or what is right wing art? I think actually those are two totally orthogonal things, and it's kind of almost a mistake to try to jam them together. But I will say, what I want people to be comfortable saying is that they are on the right, that they have right-wing beliefs as a political matter. And especially people, and I take myself to be a kind of example of this, who might code as like a lib in certain ways, certainly like my background experience. Sometimes the way I talk is sort of like a lib talks or something, but like, yeah, I want a more expansive permission structure. That's another lib word, okay, that I'm using here. I want a more expansive permission structure for people to say, yeah, I'm on the right, okay? That's what I am. And like, not in an apologetic way, which you often hear. It's like, you have to like apologize for the fact that you're on your right. No, this is just like my beliefs. And I think this is genuinely true. When you look around at the world and you think about the kinds of things I want, the kinds of things I desire for the world for me to live in and for my kids to live in, the kind of future I want, and I look around and see the kind of pathologies and bad things happening, the negative trends, the things I want very much so map onto politics that are on the right. And that's enough for now. Okay.
That's great.
So maybe that's I'm being like purposefully inspecific there.
No, I like that. That's helpful. And we do want to have a positive vision for people. It's right up in line with my personality is very like, not that. Like, I know I don't want that, and so I'm discerning enough to go, I know what I don't want.
Okay, like we can say things like, I want order.
Yeah.
I want to live in a world that I don't have to be afraid to walk down the street or get on the subway. I want for us to have a clear sense of, for example, like basic facts, biological facts about the world and the implications of those facts. And while there might be room for some like academic or philosophical disagreement on the margins, or when we get into, like the complex space of semiotics, for example, what is a man and a woman? As a political fact, these things should be crystal clear and without dispute. And in fact, like to have a functioning society, we need to settle on sort of common sense definitions for these biological or sort of material realities around us. I like this may be a lib belief, but I like free speech. Okay. I want a high trust society. I want a society where people can fulfill their sort of spiritual and biological imperatives. For example, to find mates and have children. I mean, it's almost like silly to even say it out loud because it's so obvious, right? But I guess it does bear, or it's like worth just like articulating these very simple things. I want prosperity, but also I live in Montana. I like to go fishing. I want clean rivers. And I want, to be able to take my kids into the woods and like not be surrounded by trash. I want open spaces. I want these things. I want to live around people that I share a culture with, and where there's an unspoken understanding of values and shared beliefs that allows us to participate in civic and public life together. And I don't want to, while I want prosperity, I don't want to sacrifice that feeling for like social trust for a little bit of extra GDP. And so there's a sort of practical aspect to these politics as well, where it's not enough to just believe in ideology and principle. There's always a kind of question of, does this work or not? And if it doesn't work perfectly, we need to be able to like sort of balance this out, because humans are complex and human society is complex. And anyone saying has the perfect answer for this is a liar, and should be like not trusted, because it's just more complicated than that. Okay, now I'm sort of like going off in all sorts of directions, but
yeah. That's great. I love it. It's a beautiful vision. And with that,
I'm losing it here.
You're fine. With aesthetics play a much bigger role than I think most people think. And in our modern world, there's very much like this global homo trend of a flattening of aesthetics, and actually not like, I would say even a perversion in a lot of art. And you're totally right. Like, it's so refreshing when I find somebody who is, whether you call them conservative, right wing, whatever, who's not left in that space, whether it's the academy, literature, art, music. And it's like, really? That's fun. Like, that's great to meet you. So tell me, what does aesthetics look like? You painted kind of a vision of wants and desires and that kind of thing. What does aesthetics look like going forward, particularly with Passage Press, or maybe you can speak more broadly to that?
Okay, so this is a question that this is going to sound evasive, but I've been saying this for a long time now. So this is what I can say about what happens next. What is an aesthetic sort of sensibility that can arise or emerge out of all this stuff that's going on, that is both in opposition to the left, or is just, I shouldn't even say in opposition to, it's just not the left, but is also affirming a kind of positive vision of the world that is speaking to, I use this word called like truth, and it's a vague word, but there are spiritual truths, there are moral truths, there are all sorts of different ways we can conceive of truth. Now, how do we develop an aesthetic that honors a commitment to that truth is something that I think needs to be discovered. And when I think about my own attempts at art and writing and literature, and the writers and artists I've talked to, and whether it's filmmakers or novelists or whatever, one consistent quality is this sense that the act of creativity is stepping into the darkness. It's stepping into the unknown, and it's reaching out into the unknown, and you're kind of feeling around in the dark, and you're going to pull something out of that, and you're not always quite sure what that's going to be and what that's going to look like. And you have to sort of trust in whatever this urge is to create that's driving you to this process, that if you are authentic and earnest in these attempts to create something, and whatever you do pull out of that is the thing you were supposed to, that's the thing that you got to hold up to the world and show the world. And you can't predict what that is ahead of time. It has to be discovered. And one thing I'm very wary of here is saying, okay, writers, artists, whoever's listening to this, here's the kind of thing I want to see and I want you to produce, because that's the thing that's going to be like the new right wing art of the future. I don't know. I have a tremendous amount of humility when it comes to predicting these things. And, I do know if some people don't like that answer, they find it sort of cowardly or evasive, like I said, but it's the truth. I just don't know what it's going to look like. It's one of those things you kind of like know it when you see it. And even then, maybe not. Maybe it's going to take 10, 20, 30 years. And only looking back do we say, oh, that was the thing. That was the set of sort of images and themes and a kind of aesthetic vocabulary that constituted this bridge that we're going to use to walk into the future. We might just not even know it when the first time we see it.
One of the things that I found myself either accused of or put into a box on is that I'm part of something called the dissident right. I don't know what that is. I mean, I've looked it up, and I've like read some people, I guess, that are associated with this broader movement, but
Yeah.
maybe help me understand. Like, I've also been called, this is funny. I think I read Machiavelli once in like high school, and I probably didn't like it at the time. And people,
Yeah.
when I just say, like you said, I want this, I want that, I don't want that, they're like, you sound Machiavellian. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't, look, man, call me what you want. But it's kind of like that with dissident right. But maybe help me understand, what is the dissident right? Because I think,
Sure.
would it be fair to say that you're in kind of that ecosystem?
Yeah, it would probably be fair. I don't like these labels either. I think they're incomplete and often do more harm than help. They obscure more than they clarify. Oftentimes, like I've been called like a Nietzschean in the way that you've been called a Machiavellian. I've read like maybe 50 pages of Nietzsche, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I had to read some for grad school, and I've skimmed it here and there, but people usually the people using these labels have bad intentions for doing so, and so always tend to sort of avoid them. But if we're just being like, in terms of clarifying where we sit and what a lot of this energy is a response to be a dissident obviously implies something that you are dissenting against. And so the question is, what are we dissenting against? And for me, it's some combination of like the left, of course, but actually more importantly, the other thing is the sort of status quo anti-conservatism that prevailed probably for, most of the post-Cold War period. And this is a conservatism that really was, and I think self-consciously was, a kind of like, was Reagan's three-legged stool of, sort of business-friendly libertarians, and then some social conservative Christians, and then you also had these foreign policy hawks. But it wasn't terribly concerned with culture, and it was sort of stuffy and old-fashioned and kind of boring, frankly, and then also politically, basically from the time of Bush to Trump, was sort of impotent. It failed. It didn't win. It really did just sort of like collapse under its own weight, and we needed a reset. And there's a lot of us who thought this old way of thinking about politics just isn't working. We need something new. We need something fresh. And so the dissident right is probably just some broad constellation of different ways of manifesting a sort of American right or American conservatism.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, yeah, I guess I got cast type as like that because I was like fed up with like, there's got to be better answers than what we're getting right now. Like, there have to be, surely people before 100 years ago dealt with plagues. Surely they thought about social arrangements differently than just what we have right now. Maybe they have something to offer. And like, I toyed with like, I wasn't into politics at all. And then I like, everybody's like, Reagan is our conservative hero. And I looked at Reagan, I was like, I don't know. Like, and then I kept going back and back. And now I've got friends feeding me Aristotle and all this stuff. And I'm just trying to get more familiar with like ideas that would be considered, I guess, dissident because they buck against the prevailing trend.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important too to realize that there are just political realities that precede this, and I try to be like fair, try to be charitable, and the thing is, the conservatism that came before us that we're rejecting right now is was designed to win the Cold War. It was designed to defeat communism, essentially, and it did. It won the Cold War. I mean, people like to say that the country's always moving left, and that's sort of true in some ways. Like Curtis always says this, everything moves left. There's this like left wing ratchet. And like, I get that in some ways, but there are also these time limited exceptions to that. Like the right, Reagan really did win the Cold War. So like these guys succeeded, and we should acknowledge that, but then also say, look, the world has moved on. We're not in the Cold War anymore.
Right.
Circumstances have totally changed, and now we need to adapt to these new circumstances. And I think that old guard was just really stubborn. They were unwilling. There was a lack of mandate as well to move on, and the donor class. And we can get into all the systematic reasons why. But yeah, we needed to move on, and we need new answers.
Okay, so going forward then, whether you call it right wing, whether you call it whatever you want, we have Trump in the White House. We have some good things going on politically. We have, I sense a great deal of cultural renewal, maybe we could call it that, and cultural resistance in states like Colorado, where I'm seeing a wide swath of people reject transgender ideology, even though they just passed a terrible bill here. I'm seeing a lot of momentum and positivity towards the right, not the left. Where do you see this heading in like the next 10 years?
I think there's an incredible opportunity on the right. In fact, in my lifetime, never has there been such an opportunity to reimagine the cultural space. And politics play into that, but I want to focus here on culture for a second. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, just as the right that I was just talking about sort of exhausted itself, and there was this need to move on from that. The left, the mainstream left, the sort of liberal left that sort of dominated cultural life throughout the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, into the Obama years, has also exhausted itself. There really are not producing, I mean, it's just like an objective thing. They're just not producing good stuff. They're not producing stuff that is sustaining the interest of the vast majority of people. They found themselves trapped in this awful cycle of woke, whatever you want to call it. And I think for reasons we spoke about earlier, the sorts of values that are embedded in these institutions are designed to resist disruption and change. And so they're having a really hard time. And what's interesting is when you talk to the heads of movie studios or publishing houses, you will hear privately them worry about the future of these institutions, but they are unable to do anything about it. They are captured in maybe the way the church is captured by, its audience or whatever. These institutions are also captured by this sort of Longhouse style of organization. And so the right is sort of primed to step in and sort of take over some of this space. It's also the case that for the first time in my life, the right has attracted young people, very young people in some cases, precisely the kind of people who make and dictate what accounts for good culture. So I've also noticed, there's some interest in this from, political actors who might have been previously just sort of uninterested in political or cultural stuff. And this is both like a donor thing, but also, maybe there's going to be some push to do something about this at, state levels or community theaters or, places like the Kennedy Center, et cetera. So I really see a real opportunity here. Now, what's missing from this right now is content, is good stuff. We're starting to like collect a certain amount of opportunity, energy, and platforms to distribute it. But now we got to actually like get artists and creators to make good stuff. And once we do, I think we'll be in a really good place.
Kind of my last question, and this is, if the audience hasn't picked up on it now, having Lomez on is breaking one of my rules. Actually, my description of my podcast, I typically have evangelicals on. Lomez does not identify as an evangelical, but I did want to hear from you, either as much as you're willing to share on kind of like what role Christianity is this nation's heritage,
Yeah.
plays in this kind of future. And maybe I'll frame it this way. I'll provide a bit of a thesis, is that without kind of a renewal of spiritual formation culturally, that kind of fills that, we'll just replay. We may recapture ground and it may revert back to like we'll hit a reset button and go back to some things, but without a deep soul level renewal of people. I'm not trying to put like revival ahead of cultural renewal. I think those things are much more dynamic than just a linear like politics follows culture, culture follows politics. I really don't find those helpful explainers. The way I've explained it is like our Western civilization is like a cut flower. And when I get flowers from the store, bring them home, those flowers are going to die. Now, a flower in a garden is going to die if you don't nurture it. And of course, there's seasons, that kind of thing. But we've uprooted everything from the soil in which Western civilization was sprung. Now, we could argue about, was Western civilization more Greek or Roman, or was it more Christian? Of course, as a Christian, I feel like it's very indebted to Christianity. But I wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on that, where Christianity fits in this positive forward vision of where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, it is the substrate of all of it. My own sort of personal spiritual path is a complicated thing that, I tend to keep publicly private, but what I do feel extremely strongly about is that America is a Christian nation and always has been. And it's at times been more implicit than other times. But, something I taught actually at UC Irvine was a class on civil religion and our civil religious tradition. And, it's really uncontroversial for people who study this stuff and look carefully, whether it's our legal traditions, our cultural traditions, everything about our founding and formation throughout various regimes within America, all have this very robust and unmistakable and unmovable, frankly, Christian substrate, and really, frankly, Protestant substrate, if you want to get, super specific about it. And America, as we understand it, as it has always existed, is not a thing, decoheres without that substrate.
Yeah.
Any kind of, and this is something I've written about in American Mind and elsewhere. I take certain cues about this from T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot's another sort of somewhat complicated right-wing artistic figure. He's a modernist. He's also an Anglican. And anyway, he also sort of had this belief, and very well spelled out actually in this essay called Notes Toward a Definition of Culture. It's so like this very long essay, but that any kind of high culture, certainly one within sort of Western civilization, broadly speaking, whether it's America or England or elsewhere, actually depends on a kind of Christian metaphysics, Christian belief, really. Because for all we talk about like being honest or truthful or, practical or having common sense or, digging into this sort of like philosophical wisdom that precedes us, it has to be tethered to something. And, there, you can't just like that anchor, that pull that tethers this all, to something concrete is not something you can just sort of like fabricate willy-nilly. Like it doesn't just emerge. It's not an emergent phenomenon. Like it's already there, and we need to sort of recapture it. And in some, I think we're still tied to it, honestly, but we need to strengthen that, that connection and be, again, like, it really in some sense is just a matter of being forceful about it and unashamed of it and just saying it out loud. But also, I think I really want to like suggest to people that we also want to be aware of our goals here, and we don't want to alienate people or like provoke them in a way that's going to create hostility. So, this may sound like sort of hypocritical or ironic coming from someone who's like an anon, poster, but we want to be considerate about this rhetoric and how we frame these conversations, but in a way that doesn't compromise on these core beliefs. I hope I
Yeah.
answered the question. Maybe
No, I
maybe
think
to
so.
some
Yeah,
extent.
it's similar stuff to what I've said. We want to honor our forefathers, and we want to honor those who came before us. We don't need to needlessly alienate those
Yeah.
who we would find great agreement with. I guess help me understand, as somebody who says we're a Christian nation, as someone who's promoting what I perceive to be very compatible beliefs with Christianity and art and literature. What are questions? Because like here's a thing that's going on right now. There's like, what if we want to call them the dissident right or whatever? There's kind of this community of, I would say, generally agnostic but appreciative of religion and the importance it plays in civic life and cultural stuff. um, there was a tons of literature written against the new atheist Sam Harris
Yeah.
back 30 years ago, and I'm curious, what are the questions that you would have? And I know you got to go, so we're not going to answer them on air necessarily. We can always chat offline. But what are the questions that you see bubbling up, either, whether it's for you, why, what's going to keep me from responding to Christ's call to repent of my sins, or
Mm.
amongst others? What are the things that are kind of like the questions that people are asking who do forward cultural Christianity, who do want to honor our Christian nation and Christian heritage? What are the things that are maybe keeping them from, or they perceive as like roadblocks to them committing to Christ?
It's a really interesting question. And I would hazard that it's sort of deeply personal, and anybody you might ask to reflect on that would have a different answer. Uh, One thing I think that's common among people our age, and maybe even among people on the right, the left certainly, but people on the right, is we sort of grew up, at least I did, I'm a coastal, again, this like coastal lib milieu, in many ways alienated from a sense of tradition. That America, there's this idea America's like this clean slate. You show up on America's shores, you're this blank canvas, and you reinvent yourself, and like anything that came before is like in flux. It's negotiable. um, and that was almost perceived as like a value that should be sort of inculcated by young people. We should embrace this sense of alienation and atomization, and we were all just these sort of like atomized, GDP widgets moving around the map and just trying to maximize our own happiness or whatever. And I think there was some hope maybe that would be enough to sustain a culture and sustain a nation. I think very obviously it's not. I think people were very foolish to ever believe that was. And I think one by one, some people are coming around to realize that their own complicity in that foolishness needs to be rethought. And where that ultimately leads is, okay, what actually am I connected to on some like deeper level? And what are the kinds of things I want? And hey, wait a minute. There's already this like rich sort of culture in place with a set of traditions and values that I can just slot right into, and it actually does satisfy all of these things that I felt were like missing from my life as a sort of like modern Western man or woman. And how willing people are to come around to that realization. And so like there's this rational element to it. But then, there's the other part, which is like, do you feel it? Okay. And then that's the part that's often evasive and sort of ineffable and difficult to maybe, I don't know, predict. But I would say that among other things, it's just like getting people to acknowledge that modern American life, as they perceived it for a large parts of the last, like, let's say 30 years, maybe longer, is incomplete without this piece. And that if they want better lives for themselves, for their kids, for their communities, it's worth investing their time and efforts and like heart to this thing. But you know, getting people there, I guess that's your job more than it is my
I'm trying. Well, it sounds like you're almost there, brother. I think I'll send you some resources offline, but I know you got to run. So I wanted to thank you for your time, and also make sure to promote what Passage Press, follow you on Twitter. Is there anywhere else that people should keep up with the work you're doing?
Yeah, please, you know, passage.press, the Twitter account. I'm at Lomez on Twitter. We got a bunch of stuff coming out that I think maybe your audience will be interested in. We're actually, we've hired a great husband and a wife team who are going to be editing a homeschool imprint. So we're going to be coming out with, you know, it's based on Charlotte Mason curriculum. And so I know a lot of people in this space are probably interested in that sort of material. So we're trying our best to like, you know, meet people where they're at with this stuff. And we want people to have these resources for themselves, their families. We also, we're going to be starting and announcing a sci-fi sort of pulp genre imprint that we're really excited about called Arc Press, and people can find that as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and, you know, we're trying our best, like I said, to do this quickly, but also, you know, high quality, and make sure it's good stuff that, and people will, you know, sort of trust our judgment on.
That's great. All right, I'll put a link to that in the show note for the listeners. John, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Chase. Really appreciate it, man.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lomez. Plenty more we could talk about. I could have talked with him for a few hours, I'm sure, because we could have gotten more into right wing versus left wing, the importance of aesthetics and culture building. And ultimately, we could talk more about Christianity and its role in the future of revitalization in the West. Do pray for Lomez and the work he's doing, and that he would know the Lord. Before we sign off for the day, I wanted to remind you of a great product that I use called Ion Layer. These are patches, medical grade patches that you can use to get N80 plus infusions without the IV drip. I don't know about you, but I personally do not like needles. Anytime I go get my blood drawn, I nearly pass out. I don't know why. It's physiological. I look away. I think I'd be fine, and I'm not. And so this is a great patch for me because it is a way to get an N80 plus infusion without the hassle of a needle. Plus, it is so much cheaper than going to one of those places where you can get an N80 plus infusion. An N80 plus infusion is simply a great way to boost your energy, your mood, your mental acuity. It helps with basic amino acid components in your body that your body already generates, and it just boosts those as you age. Those decline. And so it's a great way to stay young, healthy, and vibrant as we seek to build and reinvest in the Christian West. So head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT, and get $100 off your first kit. That's ionlayer.com. Use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.